Hello again. Look, the next few minutes are just some background for you. Like I say here, introductory facts about Native Americans. Um, let's take a look at the first of those introductory facts. How many were there? I like really tangible questions. I like these questions that put things I can get my arms around. If you don't know, am an anthropologist who studies the ancient Maya of Central America. One of the things I want to know, and I think I have a pretty good fix on this, and I'll mention in a minute, is how many people lived there at contact. And the number's staggering, just staggering. But what about Native Americans in the United States? Well, on this slide, I've got um, information about North America, Mexico, and Central America, which is everything south of Mexico. And where it says range, that is what I see in published papers and books and that sort of thing over time, people making reasonable and sometimes unreasonable best estimates. So the range I see published for North America, population, the lowest numbers I've seen are about 900,000, 0.9 million people. And the highest I've seen is 12,250,000. Well, that's giant range, about 13 times bigger from the biggest, about 13 times bigger than the smallest. That doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And I think the reality is, from all the data, and it's kind of intuitive, I admit it, all the data that I see, the best guess is closer to 10 million people. We'll just take the Caddo of East Texas. When we have our first surveys, censuses, in the 1750s of them, there were about 40 or 50,000 people. Weren't that many for quite a while after that. Well, then they declined really rapidly. But we also see every reason to think that they declined very rapidly before then. So I think we're probably looking at 100, 200,000 people in East Texas, not 50,000 people, or 40, whatever it would be. Um, Actually revisiting that, the actual number that is counted in the 1750s is about 20,000. So I'm still thinking 100, 200,000 people wouldn't be unrealistic given what we see in the archaeological record. Extrapolate that to the whole United States. I'm skipping Alaska here. Um, the best guess is probably 10 million people. Compare that to Mexico. Mexico, when you look at population estimates that people project, 3.2 million to 37 million people. Again, a huge 10 times difference range. My best guess is it probably had to be at least 20 million. Okay. And in Central America, that would be the countries of Belize and Honduras and Guatemala, Salvador. The published ranges are between 100,000 and 13.5 million. That's insanely too much. My best guess, a couple of million. Okay. And that would be a couple of million at contact. Now, if you ratchet back in time to the population maximum of the ancient Maya civilization, you're talking about 25 million people at that time. Yes, population probably dropped over a millennium about 90%. All right, gives you a little sense of it. Let's take a look at the next slide. What about today? Top row is the United States in general. Second row are Native Americans in the United States. Back in 1980, and this is actually for other reasons should scare you, 1980, we had 225 million people in the United States. In 2000, 20 years later, we're up to 281 million. 2010, 308 million. 2020, and you know this is behind, 330 million. So 50% increase in population in 40 years. There are many that wonder about the sustainability about that, and that's another question. Go back to 1980, and there were 1.5 million Native Americans out of that 200 million. So, you know, 0.75%. By 2000, the Native American population had come close to doubling, while the U.S. population had gone up, what is that, like 30%? Go to 2010, and the U.S. population was 300 million, but the Native American population doubled in 10 years to 5.2 million. And then more currently, go back to 2020, 330 million people in the United States, pushing 7 million. And that's like a 40% increase over the next 10 years again. Well, what explains that? Obviously, the Native American population is growing much more rapid than the general United States population. And two things explain that. One is self-determination. Tribes are now operating under a principle of self-determination where they can choose to a degree who's allowed to be called a tribal member. And there's also a revitalization movement going on. So it's not that 1.5 million people in 1980 became 7 million in 2020. It's that many people who were buried in other parts of society decided to declare themselves who they really were and always knew they were. They were Native Americans. I had a dear friend, he passed away, and a dear friend who was a Native American who lived in San Antonio, in South San Antonio, and he was in Hispanic neighborhoods. As a child, he was bullied because he looked like he's a Mexican American, but couldn't speak Spanish. And, you know, kids can be brutal no matter what their backgrounds. And he tried to hide for many years the fact that he was Native American, and as an adult became quite proud of it, and announced, if you will, came out as Native. And there are thousands and millions of stories like that of people who've always known that they were from Native American backgrounds, but didn't really realize that there was a viable way for them to celebrate that Native Americanness. So these numbers have grown by people who have not been included on the rolls back in the 1930s. Here we are almost 100 years later, and they're declaring that they always were Native American. So there's some really complicated issues around that, and we're going to get to some of those later too. Let's look at the next slide. Again, this is the total population. This is kind of blurry, so I'm not going to dwell on this, but it is quite clear that in Native America and Alaska, populations are just going up and up and up. Where are they? You know, okay, we got a pretty good fix on the number. There's 7 million people. That's a lot. That's like the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex. But where do they live? And here's a map of population density. And I think you will be able to see the cursor. We have high points, of course, in Oklahoma. And the Oklahoma situation is very clear. Oklahoma was once known as Indian Territory. It was the legal term. It went from where all the Native Americans from Georgia, Florida, Mississippi, Alabama were forced out of those states to Oklahoma, basically in the early 19th century, when Anglo settlers and people led by President Andrew Jackson wanted them to be removed and wanted them to go someplace else. And Oklahoma was okay. It says so on the license plate. It must be true. So there's a big hot spot there. Look at northern New Mexico and northern Arizona. That's the Hopi tribe. That's the Navajo tribe. That's the Acoma Pueblo people. There are 13 Pueblos towns along the Rio Grande. All of them are now separate reservations, Taos Pecaries and so forth. The Navajos are very large. It's the largest tribe in the United States. Apaches are also there. So that's a huge center of Native American population. If you lived in New Mexico or Arizona, escaping the obviousness that Native America had a big impact on today, that would be nearly impossible to do. If you look in the West Coast, hot spots in the Northwest, and the northwest part of California, and a few others happen to be, oddly enough, Minnesota has a very high population. So that's kind of where they are today, okay? And yet there's lots of yellow in Texas, but we'll get to that. Here's a state-by-state breakdown and how much it's changed. In 2010, I don't have a more recent number for this particular figure. There were 620,000 Native Americans in California, 227,000 30 years earlier. The second largest is Oklahoma, nearly 400,000. It's surely over 400,000 today. Arizona, 300,000. New Mexico, 200,000. Alaska, 120,000. North Carolina, 130,000. It's actually grown faster than Alaska. I'm not sure why it isn't placed in fifth. I did this, so you'd think I would have done it correctly. Washington State, 160,000. I guess these are the 1980 orders and how they've grown. South Dakota, 68,000. Texas went from 40,000 to 215,000. We're now about the third largest population of Native Americans in the United States are in Texas. Michigan, 125, New York, 170, Montana, pretty sparse state, even though it's well known for Native America, 65,000, Minnesota, 80,000, Wisconsin, 70,000, Oregon, 85,000. In Oregon, I happen to know that a couple of different tribes had to fight for many, many years to be recognized as Native American tribes, especially along the Columbia River Gorge and places like that. So those are the big 15 states. This is, I wish all these figures were from the same date. Sorry, don't have them. They're kind of harder to get some days than others. Where do Texas Indians live? In Texas. Here are the top 10 counties. And if you don't recognize the counties, I'll help you out with that. The biggest is Dallas County. You're shocked. With 9,500 people in 1990, that's going to be 15,000 now or more. Harris County, that's Houston, 8,000. Tarrant County, Fort Worth, over 5,000. Bexar County, which is San Antonio, 4,200. El Paso, 26,000. That's much higher because of a recognition issue than it was then. Travis County, that's Austin, 2,000. Travis County's quadrupled in size since then, so sure that number is much higher. Denton, which is just north of Dallas and Houston, so it's part of that big agglomeration. Another 1,400. Nueces, that's Corpus Christi, 1,100. Collin County, Grayson County, like Denton, they're north of Dallas and Fort Worth. So when you agglomerate them all, you have the biggest collection by far of native peoples are in North Texas. There are also Texas Indians who live on reservations. The ones I mentioned before are mostly ones who live in urban areas and, buy a house and live next door to you. But there are also reservations in Texas. It's a very complicated topic, and we'll talk about it. But the Native Americans on Texas reservations, there are 3 reservations. And there's the Alabama and Coushatta Indian Reservation. You'll be surprised to hear that they came from Alabama. The Alabama people lived on the Alabama River. That's what it's named for. Coushatta people lived about 10 miles away where a stream came into the Alabama River. They both moved because the French built a fort and overlooking their village, and they thought, that's not too comfy, so off they went. And there are dozens, probably hundreds, of Indian villages labeled in historic maps going across Mississippi and Louisiana all the way to Texas. And these are the stopping over points. Maybe they were intended to be permanent homes, I'm not quite sure, of the Alabama and Coushatta people. Well, in 1980, there were 477 of them. In 2010, there were over 1,100. 2025, probably 2,000. Maybe we'll ask before the semester's over. The Tiwa. Now, the Tiwa people were refugees, depending on your view, from the Pueblo Revolt in northern New Mexico of the early 17th century. And what happened is that literally the Pueblos, the 13 towns, rose up against the Spanish occupiers and threw them out. Went badly for the Spanish. But some people went with them from northern New Mexico down the Rio Grande, ultimately to today's city of El Paso, and they became the Tiwa of the town is called Isleta. That's the name of their original town. Del Sur of the south. So these are people from Isleta. Their descendants say they were kidnapped by the Spanish. The people in Isleta of the north say that their ancestors were in fact collaborators with the Spanish and thrown out with Spanish. So there's to this day a very different view of that history, and also a different view of how much they like each other. One model has you being heroes, the other model has you being villains. And the Kickapoo people are a northern group, known as an Algonquian speaking group. That's their language. They were first met somewhere in Michigan, as we understand, or maybe Wisconsin. It's a little uncertain where the chronicler was when they at that time. They moved out to the plains to get away from the French, a seemingly constant process. They moved out to the plains to get away from the French and became vicious raiders of other people, European farmsteads, other native tribes. And they got, this is such an odd story, they got the attention of the Mexican government. And the Mexican government had a defensive line to keep raiders, particularly Apaches, out for many, many years. And then they didn't need it anymore, so they closed it down. So they suddenly needed it again. Apache people were raiding down into the cities of Saltillo and so forth. And the Mexican government invited the Tiwa, or the Kickapoo, to come to Mexico and take up residency. They gave them a huge reservation. In the 1950s, they began doing itinerant farm labor in the United States. And some of them began staying over in Piedras Negras. And soon after a while, they stayed permanently. So by 1980, there were 750 of them, and by 2010, there were 1,600. That number again has gone up a lot. So some totals. It gives you an idea of how dynamic this whole situation is too. 1980, the total number of people living on reservations in Texas was 40,000 people. By 1990, it went up to 65,000 people. The number in 2010, those three reservations, is 170,000 people. Yeah, things are, academics like to use the word dynamic. Dynamic simply means it's changing rapidly. And it is changing rapidly, and their situation is changing rapidly, and that's going to be a really rich part of what we look at in the last part of this class. Oh, this is a little small, but I think you can see it. Here are 10 questions that I always hear. So I figured let's get them done with up front. Who are these people? What is a tribe? Well, there are multiple answers to that question. A tribe is the name that has been traditionally given to people of the plains of the United States. And these would be Sioux, Blackfoot people like that. In some sense, Apaches, in some sense, Cheyennes. A tribe is, as an anthropologist once said it, his name is Elman Service. A tribe is a political unit that has a leadership consisting of elder men who make decisions for the tribe. Okay, and that's a tribal council approach. Service defined 4 different levels of socio-political scale. The smallest is a band, which may be 20 people, where there's no permanent leadership. I'm a leader because I can tell good stories for a while. Somebody else can cook. They become a leader for a while. Somebody else can hunt or take us to the right places to go for food. They become a leader for a while, but there's no permanent leader. A chieftain, like the Caddo people of East Texas, literally has a chief, a leader for life, and others that support him. It's usually him. And a tribe is both bigger, can be hundreds of people to a couple of thousand people, and more complicated. And there are many people, many men usually, who are in positions of authority and power, mostly because of their position with their own lineage. Okay, that's a tribe, from an anthropologist's point of view. From a legal point of view, it's also the term that has been adapted by the United States of America for legal description of contemporary people. So there is a Kickapoo tribe of Oklahoma. There's also a Kickapoo tribe of Texas. And there's also, some of them moved to Oklahoma, but they don't want to go into part of the other Oklahoma people. There's a Kickapoo tribe of Texas, the Oklahoma branch. Okay, so it's complicated. You're dealing with a lot of moving parts. But a tribe is 2 things. It's an anthropological word that describes a social organization that doesn't exist today, but it's also a legal term that discusses a particular group of people. Are Indians U.S.? What is a treaty? Sorry, I missed one. You hear about this all the time, all kinds of use of this term, but what it is the highest form of agreement between 2 governments. It has to be passed by the Congress or wherever they have in each country. And usually that's a higher than normal percent. It's not just 50% plus 1. It's usually like 2/3 majority. It has to be signed by the president of the country, and it binds both countries together. okay? Like in a treaty that says, I'm not going to build nuclear bombs if you don't build nuclear bombs. If we all agree to that, then, maybe it's safer. The United States government signed, I'm not sure the number off the top of my head, but I want to say it's 753 treaties with Native American groups. Now, what that means is that the United States government agreed that this other group is itself a government, itself a nation, itself a political entity. They signed 753 of these. And that means that the Kickapoo people, the Alabama Coushatta people, the Caddo people, are legal, the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, are legally believed by the United States government to be another country. And what they did in these treaties, they said, here, we'll take this land, you take this land, is everybody agreement, then we're never going to do this again. In fact, out of those 753 treaties, every single one was broken by the United States government. And that is the underlying basis for where we are today. Are Indians U.S. citizens and can they vote? Yes and yes. You'll hear about this later, but when Judge Marshall was the Supreme Court, was Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, just after 1800, the court passed an important decision, I think is the right way to say it, decision that defined the relationship of the United States government with Native American nations. And because of that, they can be two things at once in a certain way. They can be exempt from state laws. So you go to Oklahoma and you get into the tribal lands and there's a casino that's banned in Oklahoma by the state, but Indians are not bound to that. So they're different. At the same time, are they U.S. citizens? Yes. And many, 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 many Native, especially men, have served in our armed forces. Not the least of reason is that Native peoples are commonly living in places that non-Native peoples didn't want to live. So they tend to be pretty poor. So becoming an enlisted serviceman is a prideful thing for Native men. What is the Bureau of Indian Affairs? Simply enough, that is a branch of the Department of the Interior of the United States, and it's the organization that deals with tribes. So of the existing tribes, they don't go to Washington and go visit the President of the United States. They connect to the United States government through the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And that has been in existence for about 150 years. It has been very good. It has sometimes been very terrible, depending on leadership and approaches. It's the way life is. What is the Dawes Act? In the late 19th century, a senator named Dawes pushed forward a bill that caused the census of all Native American peoples. It took him 40 years to do it, but it's government. It's kind of quick. The Dawes Act basically said we will recognize all Native American tribes. We'd like to know who they are and who's the leadership. So the census basically was intended to collect the names, addresses, and email addresses of all Native peoples in 1930. Well, of course it didn't work because just finding everyone was difficult, and many, many tribes complained they never came to us and asked us who we were, and never sensed us. So there's been a lot of things that happened since the Dawes Act that have expanded on the Dawes survey and census. But the major thing is that today, if you wish to join a Native American tribe, you need to, let's say you're going to become Indian, you need to demonstrate that you have a relationship, a biological relationship with someone who is on the rolls of the Dawes Act census. And every tribe has that. So if I wanted to become Cherokee, I would have to, well, sure, there are other ways of doing it besides just going there these days, but I'd have to go to Oklahoma to the Cherokee offices and find where my, say, grandfather was Cherokee and establish my relationship with him, and then potentially I could be also Cherokee. Now, I'm German, so no, I can't do that. They'd laugh a great deal. I think I was pretty silly. The other component of that is called blood quantum. It's a pretty easy concept. If I married a biologically fully native person and we had a kid, she would be 100% blood quantum, I'd be 0, the kid would be 50. The kid marries a non-Indian, they have a kid, it's 25%, and so on, okay? So blood quantum is the measure that each tribe requires in order to accept someone to the tribe. What does that mean? Well, it means that I can't be a Cherokee. It means that I can never be a Cherokee because my blood quantum is a big goose egg, which is 0. It means that there's a limit to who can be Cherokee. Before the 1970s, that limit was placed on all tribes by the United States government. In the 1970s, following the then policy of self-determination, tribes were able to decide for themselves what blood quantum they would accept. So you see some tribes who will not accept anything less than 50%. You'll see other tribes, the Cherokee people live, the Western Cherokee in Oklahoma, live in a horrible place in Oklahoma. They have no money, they have no financial resources, they don't have timber, they don't have oil, they're too far to go from anybody to have casinos. So they realize the one thing they can do to increase their flow of money is have more people. So they went from about 1/2 blood quantum to decided they would take people up to 1/640th blood quantum, making their numbers swell hugely. Okay. Now most of these 1/640th live in cities everywhere else. They don't actually live on in the Oklahoma heartland or anything like that. And they like carrying around a card that says I can prove I'm an Indian. And they probably have very little participation in the day-to-day life of the Cherokees. Which gets me to, I'm not quite sure what question we're on, but it's the one about making a living. How do Indians make a living? Well, like everybody else, okay? But kind of unlike everybody else, there is a bond between Native Americans and families because they are so unlike their neighbors. When I grew up, when I was in your chair, I was doing what I could to get as far away from the small town that I grew up in Illinois as I possibly could. I stayed in Illinois because I had a scholarship to stay in Illinois. But I was really wanting to escape the confines of that teenage world, which was actually a delightful teenage world because I had a fantastic childhood. Don't know why I wanted to get away from it, but I did. Um, but I can go all kinds of places and find people like me. And that turned out to be a wonderful and rich part of my life. But you can't, if you're Cherokee or Choctaw, um, go to Los Angeles and find a bunch of other Choctaws to hang around with. It doesn't work that way. The bond within families is very strong. So one thing about making a living is you've got a little inch of environmental determinism involved. Um, if you live in Oklahoma and there aren't really good jobs, you can move to North Texas, which is the process we've already kind of identified, right? If you live in Oklahoma and you are fortunate enough to be a Choctaw living close enough to um, um, cities and urban areas that a casino works for them, and I think the Choctaws have like 50 casinos, some of them really small, like, casinos inside of a gas station, not just the big ones. Well, then you can make a living with gambling because you have a legal ability to do it when nobody else does. They also do things like sell cigarettes without state taxes attached to them, which make them a lot less expensive. So people drive well out of their way to go to the Indian cigarette stores, things like that. And of course, some people are very, very fortunate and they have oil on their property and things like that. One of the most interesting situations I know of is a very small group, about 800 members, live just south of Minneapolis, St. Paul. And Minnesota, like Texas, does not allow gambling. But this group, they're related to the Menominees, this group can do so. In fact, they have the largest casino between Las Vegas and the East Coast. And it used to be that all of the tribal members were employed in the casinos. That's not very true anymore because other people are picking in the casinos. The tribal members are effectively like stockholders in a very, 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 very lucrative business. So they tend not to work there. They tend just to be stockholders getting their checks. Now, it's going to come as no shock to you that their blood quantum is really high. They don't want new members. God, yes, there's the financial advantage alone of becoming a member of that tribe means you'd be getting thousands of dollars a year in dividends from the casinos. Well, yeah, they don't want any more people. They don't want to divide up the money. That's how surprising is that? So Native Americans do. The least income is the one people think often is the most income, and that's government subsidies, funding, and things like that. It's actually really, really, really low. Um, the Cherokee fund a small health clinic with their very large very large enrollments because of the blood quantum. But if you want to go to the Cherokee Health Clinic, and you live in San Antonio, I knew a woman in San Antonio who was a Cherokee, and if you wanted to go to the clinic and get, checked out for your sneeze, oh sure, it's just an 8-hour drive. Or you can go to all the other facilities nearby you. So the only people who really used the clinic that was funded by the very large numbers of people were the relative small number of people who lived around the clinic and were in fact day-to-day living as being Cherokee people. Kind of no surprise. The idea that Native Americans are somehow getting subsidies from the government, people write them checks and they go often, don't have to work. That's spurious in all cases. And then the last issue I'm going to take on today is the distinction between the traditional and modern Indian life. Look, some native peoples are wanting to be native peoples. I have a kind of a little itch to be a little more German. I get that. They don't want to be bothered by modern society. They don't want jobs. They have small, self-sufficient farms and ranches. I'm thinking Navajos at the moment. Some of them make pottery and things like that. They sell for a profit, and that reinvigorates their Aboriginal native life. and then and then there are many, many, many others of the opposite of the spectrum who have gone to law school, who work in factories and plants and jobs all over the place. And they are living much like I do. Okay. And while they recognize they're Indian, they recognize they're Native American, they don't live that on a day-to-day basis. And I've seen this dichotomy in every individual I've ever met, and also within every group I've ever encountered, and there's quite a few. Every individual, if you talk with them for any length of time, they will talk with you about how they want to be the traditional life they and their ancestors have always had, and how they're hurt often, but they can't have that anymore. And then there are others who would put being Indianness being behind them and just move on in our world. And then suddenly they start talking about how important tradition is. And it's like a bipolar issue with, I think, everyone I've ever met. And I think also with every group, because every group has some people that want to be modern, some want to be traditional, they're clashing, they vote against each other at consul elections and things like that. So that's in essence, that the conflict is in essence for so many problems like drug abuse and issues like that. We will address those a bit later on. There's one other last simple thing. You've heard me say Native American, you've heard me say Indian. Christopher Columbus was about a half of a world away from where he thought he was when he named Indians Indians. He thought he was going into the West Indies. He thought he was near China. Quite literally couldn't have been wronger. Native Americans don't respond to you walking up to them and saying, "Hey, are you Indian?" They're like, "Of course I'm Indian," and that's not the point. But if you know the tribe and you say, "Hey, are you Choctaw?" They'll identify by tribal names because that's what's important to them. They don't even like responding to the word Indian more often than not. And again, like 50 years ago, a big push to change the title Indian to Native American. Like, okay, lots of people like that term. Many, many people used it. And then it wasn't very many years later that the Native Hawaiians said, well, if you guys are Native Americans, we can be Native Americans too. And the Indian Native Americans did things like, no, we're not related to you. Nothing to do with you. Forget it. Get out of here. We need another word. And they came up with several tries, which is to say, just like everything else in real human life, even the names of these people are murky and muddy and messy, and that's the way it is. Sometimes the most important things are not simplistic and concrete. So you will hear me use the words Native American and Indian fundamentally interchangeably throughout this entire course. And that is because I recognize that I can't address my friends who are Indian or Native American by either of those words without offending some of them. So I state for those dear friends of mine that would be offended if they thought that I was being insensitive, either one way or the other, that I'm offending them both equally, because I can't figure out a way to not offend one of them. So as long as we understand that the meaning of those terms is kind of interchangeable, yet fundamentally both are wrong, but they refer to members of hundreds of tribal groups who are distinctly different from each other. And we say it without meaning any offense, and we say it without meaning any glomming together of peoples that shouldn't be glommed together conceptually, then I think we're okay. That's it for today. I hope you have enjoyed the time. I sure have, and I will be back with you for the next module, probably tomorrow or Wednesday. Thanks.